Say her name like that one more time, Bastien Dufour said, and his voice was so quiet that the nearest 4 tables stopped their conversations. And I'll make sure your next review runs in whatever outlet still returns your calls. The man he was addressing, Bryce Kellner, Toronto food media's most reliably insufferable presence, had spent the last 3 minutes treating Nathalie Bouvier like a prop. He had pointed a camera at her without asking. He had touched her arm without asking. He had said, loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear, that she gave the space an authentic contrast, which was not a sentence he had meant as a compliment. What Kellner hadn't understood, Nathalie had already handled it. She had stepped out of his grip with the efficiency of someone who had made that particular move more times than she should have needed to. She had looked directly at him and said, with the calm of a person who knew exactly where the exits were, "Delete the photos or I delete your reservation privileges permanently." Then she had picked up her tray and gone back to the bar. It was Dufour who stepped forward after. "I heard you," Nathalie said, without turning around. She did turn eventually, slowly. "I didn't need you to." Dufour looked at her and said nothing. "I had it handled." "You did," he said. "I'm aware." Then why? Because he was still standing there. Beat of silence passed. Nathalie looked at Kellner, who was, in fact, still standing there with the expression of a man who had only just realized he'd been outmaneuvered twice in the same conversation. She looked back at Dufour. He hadn't moved. He hadn't reached for her. He wasn't doing the thing men sometimes did after interceding, where they arranged themselves between a woman and whatever they'd just removed, as if the removing had made them permanent furniture. "You can go," she told Kellner. "Kitchen stopped seating 20 minutes ago." Kellner left without his dessert. The dining room exhaled. Nathalie set her tray on the bar with a quiet, deliberate click and looked at Dufour one more time. "Breaking someone's composure in front of a full room doesn't make you my protector." "I know that." "You knew that before you said anything." He didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. 3 weeks earlier, Nathalie Bouvier had been on her knees behind the host stand at 20 to 8 in the morning, untangling the receipt printer cable when the front door of the Selkirk opened. She looked up. The man entering did not look like someone who arrived at restaurants before they opened. He was dressed well without announcing it. The kind of man who wore expensive things and didn't need you to catalogue them. He looked at the dining room the way certain people looked at rooms, slowly, methodically, noting placement rather than decor. Nathalie filed that observation away without comment. "We don't open until 11, she said. "I'm not here to eat." He extended a card. "Paul Renaud, compliance auditor. I have an appointment with your general manager." She took the card, looked at it once, and handed it back. "Mark isn't in until 9. "I was told 8. "Then someone gave you incorrect information." She went back to the cable. "You're welcome to wait. There's coffee if you know how to use a commercial machine." A pause. "I do, actually." "Then you're ahead of most of our Friday dinner crowd." She heard him move toward the kitchen. She heard, several minutes later, the specific sounds of someone who genuinely understood what they were doing with an espresso machine. The right pressure, the right timing, none of the usual tentative fumbling of someone performing competence for an audience. He brought her a cup without being asked and set it on the host stand without ceremony. Nathalie looked at the cup, then at him. "I didn't ask for this." "No." "So why?" "You've been down there for 25 minutes. The cable will still be there." He settled into one of the waiting chairs near the window. "And so will I." She drank the coffee. It was, inconveniently, very good. Paul Renaud came back the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that, and the Tuesday after that. Mark, the Selkirk's general manager, spent a total of 40 minutes with him across all 4 visits. Nathalie spent considerably more because the compliance audit, a phrase she had begun internally annotating with light skepticism, apparently required access to the billing architecture she'd rebuilt in January, the supplier chain she'd reorganized in March, and at least one conversation per visit that had nothing to do with either. On his second visit, he noticed she had 3 books in her bag. He asked what she was reading. She told him, expecting the conversation to last 90 seconds. It lasted 40 minutes, and ended only because she realized she had forgotten to print the supplier summary she'd started before he sat down. She printed it without apologizing. He didn't ask her to. On his third visit, they argued about a novel's ending for long enough that Mireille Gourdet, the Selkirk's front-of-house manager, glanced over twice with an expression Nathalie chose not to examine too carefully. "The ending is dishonest," Nathalie said. "The ending is earned," Paul said. The character had to lose something before he could understand what he was protecting. He understood what he was protecting. He chose not to act on it. That's not a journey, that's a delay. He looked at her with that expression she was starting to recognize. Not quite amusement, not quite a challenge. Something between them that didn't have a clean name. "You argue like someone who's been on the wrong side of that particular delay." "I argue like someone who reads carefully," she said, and went back to her invoices. He stayed for another hour. He didn't push. She noticed that. The Selkirk was not, Nathalie had concluded long before Paul Renaud appeared, entirely what its menu suggested. She had understood this abstractly within her first month. Supplier payments cleared too quickly. The private dining room on the 3rd floor had no entries in the reservation system and was somehow always occupied on Thursday evenings. The men who came and went through the side entrance were not, by any reasonable interpretation, there to discuss the tasting menu. She had made a decision, early and deliberately. Do the job, keep accurate books, and don't ask questions that weren't hers to ask. She was not responsible for what the books were being kept for. She was responsible for their accuracy. That deal had served her well for 2.5 years. It had become slightly more complicated since a man calling himself a compliance auditor started sitting in the chair by the window and asking questions that no compliance audit had ever required. She did not ask him about the questions. He did not explain them. This arrangement was somehow more comfortable than it should have been. On a quiet Thursday afternoon between services, Nathalie was reconciling invoices at her desk when Paul looked up from whatever he was reading and said, without preamble, "You reorganized this entire filing system alone? No one else was going to. Your predecessor left it in bad shape. My predecessor left a shoebox and a note that said, 'Good luck.' I spent 3 weeks building something functional and the following 2 years defending it from people who found the organization threatening." He looked at her. People find organized accounting threatening. People find competence threatening when they weren't expecting it. She didn't look up from her screen. "I'm a plus-size woman doing the books for a place like this. The bar they set for me had adequate written on it. I cleared it in the first quarter and then raised the bar myself. I do that on a regular basis." "I've noticed," he said. It was not a compliment delivered for her benefit. It was an observation from someone who had been paying attention. Nathalie knew the difference. She had learned it the hard way. Over several years of being with a man who had loved her, privately and efficiently, and never once brought her somewhere a photographer might see, who had called her brilliant in quiet rooms and managed her out of every public one. She didn't look up, but something in her shoulders settled, just slightly, and stayed there. The night Bryce Kellner arrived, Nathalie had been at her desk since 5 o'clock, working through a discrepancy in the linen supplier's invoices that had been annoying her for 2 weeks. She was tired. Her coffee was cold. She had already eaten dinner, standing at the staff kitchen counter, which was not ideal, but was faster. Paul was at his corner table near the bar, as he had been 3 of the last 4 Thursday evenings, doing whatever it was he actually did on that phone, while the dinner service moved around him. Kellner arrived at 9:15 with a reservation under a name that wasn't his and a small camera crew he hadn't disclosed on the booking. He was filming a segment on Toronto's dining scene. He was also Nathalie determined within 30 seconds of his orbit, someone who used words like texture and narrative as compliments while pointing lenses at people who hadn't agreed to be pointed at. He pointed one at her. "You don't mind," he said, not a question. "I do, actually," she said, completely a statement. He laughed. He adjusted the angle to include more of her. "You're a great shot. Gives the whole place a groundedness, you know what I mean? Very real." She looked at him for precisely 2 seconds. Then she stepped to the right, out of frame, and said pleasantly, "Delete what you have, or I start a conversation with your producer about consent documentation." He grabbed her arm. The room was full. The room went quiet in a ripple from their corner outward. Nathalie looked down at his hand on her arm. She looked up at him. "You have 3 seconds to decide how this story ends." She reached over with her free hand and picked up his camera, still rolling. She turned the lens toward his face and smiled. He let go. She handed the camera back. "Thank you. Someone from management will be by with our filming policy. Enjoy what's left of your evening." She had picked up her tray and turned when Dufour's voice came from the corner table. So quiet it shouldn't have carried, and did anyway. She found out on a Saturday morning via her phone. She was at home near Roncesvalles, halfway through toast, and the Mississauga invoice discrepancy she'd brought home in her bag, when the notification came through. A Toronto media alert she'd set for restaurant industry news. The headline read, "Bastien Dufour confirmed as anonymous founder of Renouveau Grief Support Network." She put down the toast. The article was thorough. Bastien Dufour, 43, associated with several criminal investigations over the past decade, and regarded as one of the most powerful figures in the city's organized crime landscape, had been operating a network of grief counseling centers under the name of his late wife, Colette Renaud, for 6 years. All foundation documents, donor correspondence, and public communications had been filed under the name Paul Renaud. Nathalie read it twice. Then she opened the Renouveau Grief Support Network's website, which she had known about for 4 years, which her mother had attended after Nathalie's father died, which her mother had called in a January phone call 3 winters ago. The first place she'd been since the funeral, where she felt like someone was genuinely listening. She closed the website. She sat with the window for a long time. Mireille Godet arrived at her door at 11 with 2 coffees, and the expression of someone who had already read everything and was prepared to stay as long as necessary. "You knew something was off," Mireille said. It wasn't a question. "I knew the audit story was thin," Nathalie said. "I didn't know what it was covering. And now I know." Nathalie turned her mug in her hands. "I need to separate a few things. Such as, the centers are real. The conversations were real. The name wasn't. The reason for being there wasn't." She looked at Mireille. "He came to watch the business, which means he came to watch me. He's been watching you specifically for weeks," Mireille offered carefully. "That's not a point in his favor." "No, but it's information." "It is," Nathalie said. "I'm a bookkeeper. I know what to do with information. I just need a moment first." Mireille stayed for 2 hours. She did not tell Nathalie what to think. That was one of her better qualities. The press conference was on a Tuesday afternoon. Nathalie watched it on her laptop in the back office of the Selkirk between the quarterly summary and a call she postponed. She expected legal language, damage control, the careful non-apology that powerful men had been refining for decades. Bastien Dufour walked to the podium without notes. A reporter asked immediately whether the grief centers had served as financial cover. No, he said. They were grief centers. My wife died 6 years ago. She believed in those programs. I funded them because I believed in her. He paused. I used a false name because I believed my name would harm what she had built. I'm not certain I was wrong about that part. I'm certain I was wrong about the rest. Another reporter. You deceived the people running those centers. Yes. And others. Yes. He adjusted the microphone once. I used a false professional identity to access a business I had interests in. I maintained that false identity longer than was necessary or honest. The person who deserved the truth earliest received it last. He looked directly into the camera. There is no version of that which I can defend, so I won't attempt to. He didn't name her. He didn't need to. In the back office, Nathalie closed the laptop and sat with the silence until it finished doing whatever it needed to do. She gave herself 2 weeks. She finished the quarterly audit. She reorganized the third-floor filing system again. She read 3 books, one of which she had to put down twice, because something in the main character's particular brand of dishonesty, the kind that came not from malice, but from a very old fear, kept asking her a question she hadn't decided how to answer. What she kept returning to was not the deception, though the deception was real and it mattered. It was something quieter than that. It was the coffee she hadn't asked for, left at exactly the right temperature. It was 40 minutes arguing about an ending with someone who had actually read the book. It was the way he had looked at her across that room after Kellner left, not as someone waiting to be thanked, not as someone arranging himself into the space her protector was supposed to occupy, just as a man who had stayed. She had been with someone before who had loved her quietly and completely, and always, in rooms where no one important could see. She had spent 2 years being grateful for the private version, and 2 weeks, at the end, understanding what the private version had actually cost her. A man who lied because he thought you were easy to deceive, and a man who lied because he hadn't yet worked out how to be honest were not the same problem. Both were still problems. But she was an accountant. She understood that context didn't erase an error. It changed what you did with it. He came back on a Thursday morning, 4 weeks after the press conference. No card, no excuse. He sat down in the chair by the window, which was still, in some way she hadn't bothered to rename, his chair, and looked at her. "The audit is done," she said. "You don't have a reason to be here." "I know." "Then what are you doing here?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My name is Bastien Dufour. I run an organization that operates outside several laws. I funded a grief support network because my wife asked me to, and I couldn't find a reason to stop after she died." He held her gaze. "I used her name because starting over felt like the only thing I could still do for her. That is not an excuse for the lie. It's a reason. There's a difference." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." She looked at him for a moment. "My mother used one of the Renouveau centers after my father died," she said. She told me it was the first place she'd been since the funeral, where she felt like the person across from her was actually listening. She set down her pen. "I'm not telling you that to forgive anything. I'm telling you because you should know it worked. What you built worked." He looked at the window, said nothing for a moment. Colette would have wanted to know that. She would have, Nathalie said. She looked back at her screen. "You can stay for coffee if you know how to use the machine." "I'd do. Make enough for 2. The linen supplier invoices are still wrong and I'll be here until 7. He went to the kitchen without another word. Mireille, from behind the pass-through, adjusted her clipboard and said absolutely nothing. Several months passed. The Selkirk remained exactly what it was. Nathalie's books remained exactly accurate. She had reached, eventually, a clear-eyed accommodation with the nature of her employer. She kept honest records. She asked questions within the scope of her role, and she accepted that there were floors of the building whose operations were not her concern. This was not innocence. It was a considered position, and she revisited it when she needed to. The Renouveau Grief Support Network continued operating under Colette Renaud's name. Bastien Dufour was listed publicly now, in small print as its founding donor. He declined every interview request. Nathalie thought that was correct. He came for coffee on Thursdays. He argued with her about books she hadn't asked his opinion on. She argued back without softening it. He was occasionally right, which she acknowledged with the minimum words necessary, and he seemed to find that more satisfying than if she'd been generous about it. On a Thursday evening in late November, she was explaining why a supplier contract needed renegotiation before December, when he reached across the desk and set his hand over the contract, not quite pushing it aside. She looked up. "I haven't said something," he said. "You say very little in general. It's one of your better qualities." "I want to say this." He held her gaze in the way he had, steady, unperformed, a little inconveniently direct. "I am not a good man. You've looked at the books. You know what the business is." "I know what the business is," she said. "And you're still here." "I'm still here as myself," she said, "not managed around your schedule, not kept quiet, not introduced as my professional associate when there are cameras." She looked at him carefully. "If that's what you're asking about." "It is." "Then yes," she said, "I'm still here." He said what he came to say. He used too many words in the first sentence, and not enough in the second. It was the least composed thing she had ever heard from him, and it was, for that reason, the most believable. She told him it was a good opening line. Then she told him yes. Outside, November in Toronto proceeded without ceremony, cold, grey, and entirely indifferent to the significance of small moments in the back offices of high-end restaurants. Inside, Mireille refilled the espresso machine and pretended she hadn't heard anything at all, and Nathalie accepted this with the full understanding that Mireille had heard every word and would say nothing until asked. She was asked later, over the good coffee. Bastien Dufour remained exactly what he had always been, capable of silencing a room by entering it, unwilling to perform contrition for the organization he ran, the kind of man who made other men reconsider their plans, simply by staying quiet a moment too long. None of that changed. None of that was what she had needed to change. What had changed was simpler. He had walked into her room as someone else. He had stayed as himself. And he had let her decide what to do with that, without applying pressure in any of the directions available to a man like him. Nathalie Bouvier had spent enough years being loved in private, kept neatly out of inconvenient frames. She had spent enough time making herself easier to carry. She was done with all of it. Done with the careful smallness. Done with the accommodating edges. Done with the particular exhaustion of taking up less space than she actually occupied. She was not done with this. She took up every inch of it,